My parents had laughed 3 years earlier when I told them I was adopting Phoebe, a little girl who used a wheelchair. At our family barbecue, I finally understood how much of that cruelty had survived. I heard my nieces laugh and tell her, "This place wasn't designed for people like you." When I demanded to know who taught them that, my sister shrugged. "What's wrong with that? I don't want my kids spending all afternoon pushing her around." My parents nodded. I told Phoebe we were leaving. What none of them knew was that less than 10 minutes later, a black sedan would pull up and stop outside the gate. The moment my sister saw the man stepping out, the color drained from her face. Then she collapsed onto the grass, before he said a single word. If you have ever had to stand between someone you love and the people who should have loved them too, stay with me until the end. And if stories about family, courage, and second chances speak to you, you are always welcome to subscribe and listen along. By the time Phoebe and I reached my parents' house that Saturday, smoke from the charcoal grill had already drifted over the fence and settled into the warm afternoon air. Someone had put a country station on near the patio doors, loud enough that the bass seemed to vibrate through the aluminum frames of the folding chairs. My father, Walter, stood at the grill with a pair of tongs in one hand and the same faded apron he had worn at family cookouts for as long as I could remember. There were 2 shallow steps between the driveway and the back patio. My father had spent more than 30 years as a carpenter and residential contractor. He had rebuilt porches that sagged 6 inches, widened doorways in houses older than he was, and once spent an entire Thanksgiving explaining why my neighbor's deck had been constructed incorrectly. Yet after 3 years of Phoebe visiting his house, those 2 steps were still there. Walter had thrown down a sheet of plywood as a temporary ramp. One corner rested on loose gravel. Phoebe stopped in front of it and looked at the angle. She never announced these calculations. She simply studied a surface, judged what her wheels would do, and decided whether she needed help. At 11, she was already tired of strangers treating the handles on the back of her wheelchair as invitations. I held the lower edge of the plywood steady while she pushed herself upward. One wheel slipped slightly when the board shifted against the gravel. Walter caught it with his shoe and laughed about finally building something proper one of these weekends. He had been saying that since Phoebe was 8. She gave him the small, careful smile she used when politeness was easier than answering. Her hands tightened around the wheel rims for a moment before she rolled onto the patio. I noticed because I noticed almost everything about Phoebe. I knew the difference between the way she flexed her fingers when they were tired and when she was nervous. I knew she hummed under her breath, when concentrating and folded napkins into smaller and smaller squares when she wanted to disappear from a conversation. I knew she hated adults, saying she was brave for doing ordinary things. Most of all, I knew how much she wanted to be treated, as though she belonged somewhere before anyone had to rearrange the furniture for her. She had been unusually quiet that morning. Twice during breakfast, she had checked the time on her tablet. In the car, she asked how long we planned to stay at the barbecue. There was something arranged for later that afternoon, something important enough that neither of us had slept particularly well the night before. Phoebe had asked for it herself. I had promised that if she changed her mind at any point, we would leave. She kept touching the zipper of the small pouch attached to the side of her chair. I did not ask what she was checking. There had been a time when I would have filled every silence for her, believing that good parenting meant getting ahead of every fear. Phoebe had taught me that sometimes love meant leaving enough quiet for another person to decide when she was ready. My family had never been very good at that kind of patience. 3 years earlier, when I told them I intended to adopt Phoebe, Monica had laughed first. Not because I had made a joke. My sister had looked from me to our parents and given a short, disbelieving laugh, as though I had announced that I was deliberately choosing the most difficult road I could find. Dad joined in more softly. Mom did not laugh for long, but she asked whether I truly understood what I was taking on. Monica was less careful. She said I had somehow managed to choose the hardest possible version of motherhood before I had even begun. At the time, I translated their reaction into kinder language. Surprise, worry, ignorance about foster care, a need for time. I did the same for 3 years. Inaccessible restaurants became oversights. Monica's uneven field activities became thoughtlessness, and Mom telling us to make our own arrangements became her attempt not to interfere. I kept assuming familiarity would become acceptance. That Saturday was when I stopped translating. The backyard itself looked cheerful enough. Red paper plates were stacked near the grill. A bowl of melting ice held cans of soda. Taryn and Celia had left their shoes beside the grass after someone turned on a sprinkler at the far end of the yard. But the entire space had been arranged around people who walked. Folding chairs narrowed the concrete path. A cooler blocked the easiest route between the patio and the table. Half the food had been placed on a long folding table with 2 legs sunk into the lawn. Phoebe's front casters dug into the soft edge of the grass whenever she tried to turn toward it. None of those things alone would have looked cruel. That was what made them so easy for everyone else to ignore. Phoebe adjusted. She always adjusted. She chose a spot with enough room to turn her chair. She balanced her plate across her lap and moved the cooler a few inches, with 1 footplate rather than asking somebody to do it. When Celia nearly dropped 2 hot dogs trying to carry them at once, Phoebe laughed with her. For a while, I let myself believe we might get through the afternoon peacefully. Taryn was 13 now, long-limbed and increasingly aware of what the adults around her considered important. Celia was 10, and followed her older sister with the devotion of someone who had not yet decided which opinions belonged to her. Neither girl had always been unkind to Phoebe. That almost made what happened harder. Phoebe remembered every time they included her. If Taryn sent her a ridiculous video, Phoebe showed it to me twice. If Celia saved her a seat, Phoebe talked about it on the drive home. She wanted cousins, not assistants, not caretakers, just cousins. The lemonade pitcher emptied, and I went inside to refill it. The screen door stayed open behind me. At first, all I heard from outside was laughter. Then Taryn's voice carried through the doorway. I missed the beginning of whatever she had said. Celia giggled, followed by a silence that made me look up. When I stepped outside, Phoebe was no longer eating. Taryn stood near her chair, glancing toward the grassy part of the yard where the other kids had been running. This place wasn't designed for people like you. The words came out casually. That was what stopped me. Taryn did not sound like a child inventing a cruel remark on the spot. She sounded like someone repeating a sentence whose logic had already been explained to her. Phoebe lowered her head. Her face hardly moved. She simply put her plate aside and began folding the corner of her napkin. Once, then again, pressing each crease flat beneath her thumb. I set the lemonade pitcher down. I asked Taryn where she had learned to speak to Phoebe that way. Her eyes moved almost immediately toward Monica. My sister was sitting beneath the patio umbrella with one ankle crossed over the other. A bead of condensation rolled from her glass onto the arm of the chair. She followed Taryn's glance and showed no embarrassment at all. What's wrong with that? I don't want my kids spending all afternoon pushing her around. Behind her, grease struck the hot grill and hissed. Phoebe had not asked either girl to push her once. She had gotten herself up the plywood board my father had been promising to replace for 3 years. She had maneuvered around his coolers and chairs. She had carried her own food and chosen her own place at the table. The burden Monica was describing had not happened. It existed in her imagination. I looked toward Dad. Some old reflex in me still expected him to correct her. Instead, Walter's mouth tightened, and he gave a small nod. Mom followed with a slower one. Diane began trying to soften the words, explaining that Monica was only being practical and that the girls should be able to enjoy the afternoon without having to worry about helping someone else. I looked at Phoebe's hands. The napkin had become a tiny white rectangle. For 3 years, I had explained that Phoebe rarely asked for help and that accessibility was not dependence. I could have pointed out again that nobody complained when plans changed for another child's needs. None of it mattered anymore. My family did not lack information. They had decided what Phoebe's needs meant. I walked over and crouched beside her chair. "Do you want to stay?" She shook her head. I did not ask her to reconsider for Grandma. I did not tell her Monica probably had not meant it that way. I did not ask her to endure another hour so nobody could accuse us of making a scene. "Then we're leaving." I stood, took our bag from the back of a folding chair, and cleared the cooler out of her path. My mother protested behind me. She said one careless remark did not need to become a family crisis. Dad muttered that there was no reason to ruin an entire afternoon. The word ruin stayed with me. For years, Phoebe had been expected to absorb discomfort so everybody else could call the day successful. I looked back once. She didn't ruin it. Then I followed my daughter toward the gate. We had not even made it halfway across the yard when I heard a car door close on the street. Phoebe stopped. Beyond the fence, a black sedan had pulled up beside the curb. Her hands went completely still. The man who stepped from the rear door was familiar to me, because I had spent the previous week looking at photographs of him. In those photographs, he had usually been standing beside ribbon cuttings, corporate logos, shipping terminals, or people in suits. The articles attached to his name spoke about acquisitions, infrastructure projects, charitable foundations, and numbers large enough to stop meaning anything to me after the first few zeros. But, standing outside my parents' gate, he did not look like the man in those articles. He looked like someone who had forgotten how to breathe. His eyes found Phoebe. He stopped walking. Behind me, a chair scraped violently across the concrete. Monica had seen him. Of everyone in my family, she was the most likely to recognize Graham Sterling without needing an introduction. My sister followed business magazines, donor events, charity boards, and local society pages with an attention she liked to call networking. I watched recognition settle across her face before she looked from him to Phoebe. Then she understood something. The color drained from her skin. She pushed herself out of the chair too quickly, reached for the table, and missed. Monica collapsed onto the grass before Graham Sterling said a single word. The backyard erupted around her. Mom rushed forward. Dad abandoned the grill. Taryn and Celia stood frozen several feet apart, suddenly looking much younger than they had when Phoebe was alone with them. Monica came around quickly. She had frightened herself more than injured anything, but the change that followed was harder to watch than the fall. Mom looked at Phoebe and called her sweetheart. Dad began clearing the path to the gate, moving the cooler he had allowed to sit there all afternoon. Monica pushed herself upright and stared at Phoebe with a softness that had not existed 5 minutes earlier. Nothing about my daughter had changed. Her wheelchair was the same. Her body was the same. Her needs were the same. Only the man standing outside the gate was different. Phoebe noticed it too. Her eyes moved slowly from my mother lifting a chair out of her way to Monica smoothing her shirt and trying to recover her composure. I felt something in me settle. Not anger exactly. Something colder and much clearer. Graham did not walk directly toward Phoebe. That mattered. He remained near the gate until I approached him, although his eyes never seemed to leave her for long. We had agreed on certain things beforehand. No surprise embrace. No crowding her. No treating biology as permission. Phoebe had wanted this first meeting to happen near people she considered family. She had believed their presence would make the moment less frightening. Now those were the very people I needed to keep away from her. I told my parents that we were leaving, and that Phoebe's first meeting was not going to become entertainment for the backyard. Mom started to object but stopped. Monica looked as if she wanted to erase the last half hour with whatever sentence came next. I did not let her. Phoebe turned her chair toward the gate and rolled forward herself. Graham stepped aside to give her room. He did not touch the wheelchair. He did not reach for the handles. He simply made space. As we left the smell of charcoal and cut grass behind us, I noticed the wooden box tucked beneath his arm. It was small, dark with age, and scratched along the lid. The brass latch shone more brightly than the wood around it, as though someone had opened and closed it many times. Phoebe noticed it too. She looked at the box, then at the man she had spent so long wondering about. "What is that?" Graham's thumb moved slowly across the worn edge of the lid. "Something I wrote for every birthday I missed." Graham kept one hand beneath the wooden box, as if its weight came from something other than paper. Phoebe stared at it for several seconds, then looked toward me. She did that whenever a moment became too large to enter alone. I did not answer for her. I only nodded toward the car waiting at the curb, and reminded her that the next part could happen exactly as slowly as she wanted. We did not stay near my parents' house. The smell of charcoal was still caught in my clothes, and I could feel Monica's last expression following us even after the backyard disappeared behind the fence. I drove Phoebe to my library branch, which was closed for the weekend, while Graham followed in his car. I had chosen the small reading room at the rear of the building because Phoebe knew it well. She had done homework there, slept across 2 chairs during one of my late inventory nights, and once spent an entire rainy Saturday arranging astronomy books by which covers looked most like real space. The room belonged to ordinary memories. I wanted at least one thing about that afternoon to feel ordinary. Graham entered a few minutes after us carrying the same box. Without the noise of the barbecue around him, I could finally study the man whose name had filled my search history for the previous week. He was taller than I had expected, but there was nothing imposing about the way he stood in that room. He seemed uncertain where to put his hands. His jacket remained folded over one arm until he noticed the chair beside Phoebe, and even then he did not take it immediately. He asked permission before sitting. Phoebe gave a small nod. That was the first thing he did right. I had spent years watching adults make decisions around her body before asking whether she wanted them. They grabbed wheelchair handles, moved chairs out of the way without warning, pushed doors open against her wheels, or praised themselves for helping with things she had not needed help doing. Graham had enough power to make rooms rearrange themselves before he entered them, yet he waited beside one wooden chair until an 11-year-old girl told him he could sit down. The box remained on his knees. For a while, nobody touched it. A week earlier, I would not have believed we could reach that room at all. The first clue had been small enough to fit in Phoebe's palm. Months before, she had found an old metal charm among the belongings, transferred with her foster records. I had seen it before, but never understood what it meant. It carried an emblem that looked decorative until Phoebe searched it and found the same design attached to the Sterling Foundation. That search led her to an archived photograph. In it, Graham stood beside a woman I recognized from one of the few photographs in Phoebe's keepsake box. Lena Hart, Phoebe's biological mother. By the time Phoebe finally showed me what she had found, she had already spent months staring at those images alone. I contacted a reunification advocate, rather than Graham, directly. Phoebe's certified birth record carried the name Phoebe Hart, but left the father field blank. In the older case papers, however, our advocate found a copy of a hospital acknowledgement of paternity Graham had signed before Lena left with Phoebe, months before her first birthday. The document had never been filed into the later dependency record. An old photograph showed Graham with Lena, and the dates matched. Paperwork was only part of why I agreed to the meeting. Graham also knew details no article or public record contained what Lena had called Phoebe before she was born, the tiny crescent-shaped mark near her shoulder that had faded with age, and the unfinished verse Lena used to sing when Phoebe refused to sleep. None of it alone was enough to hand a child's heart to a stranger. Together, it was enough for me to stop calling him one. A formal confirmation process was still being handled carefully. I had insisted on that. So had Graham, to his credit. He never once asked me to treat his name, his money, or his certainty as proof by themselves. He accepted every boundary our advocate set. He provided records when asked. He waited when waiting was required. No document could tell me what would happen when Phoebe finally looked at him across a table. She studied his face the way she studied any uncertainty, quietly measuring it, while Graham kept catching himself staring and looking away. Now that I knew to look, I could see traces of him in her brow, and in the way both pressed their lips together while thinking. The paperwork still mattered, but the resemblance had become harder to ignore. Graham finally rested the wooden box on the table and opened the brass latch. Inside were 11 envelopes. They were not identical. Some were cream, others white, one pale blue. The handwriting changed subtly across them. The earliest numbers were written in a firmer hand. Later envelopes looked more worn, as though they had been handled often after being sealed. Each one had a number. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 11. Phoebe looked at them without touching anything. I watched her count them once, then again. Graham explained quietly that each had been written around one of her birthdays. He did not try to tell the entire story behind them. He simply said he had begun writing because there were things he wanted to say that he had nowhere else to put. I had expected Phoebe's first question to be about why he had not sent them. Instead, she asked why he had brought them all at once. Graham's fingers tightened around the edge of the box. He told her he did not know which version of him she was ready to meet. The man who wrote the first letter was not the same man who wrote the last. He thought she should decide whether she wanted any of them, all of them, or none. That answer seemed to matter to her. Phoebe reached into the box and took the envelope marked with a 1. I knew enough about the timeline to understand that the letter had been written when Graham still believed finding her was possible. The paper inside had yellowed slightly near one fold. Phoebe opened it carefully, smoothing it across the tabletop with both palms. She read in silence. I did not lean over her shoulder. Graham looked down. The room was so quiet that I could hear the building's ventilation system clicking on somewhere beyond the wall. Phoebe did not read the entire letter aloud. She stopped after a few lines and looked toward Graham when she reached something about Lena singing to her as a baby. He explained only what she asked. The letter remembered Phoebe grabbing his finger so tightly as an infant that he had joked she was already making decisions for him. It mentioned the song Lena hummed when she walked the apartment at night. It contained an ordinary promise that he would keep looking. Nothing in it sounded written for an audience. That was what made it hurt. There was no dramatic declaration about destiny, no language designed to prove what kind of father he had been. The pages held the kind of details people write when they believe they will someday have the chance to explain themselves properly. Phoebe folded the letter back along its old creases, but did not return it to the envelope. She rested it beside her hand. I had expected anger or suspicion. Instead, Phoebe looked cautious. She had spent much of her life with missing pieces filled by phrases like unavailable family and incomplete records. Now a man sat 3 feet away with 11 years of words addressed to her absence. It erased nothing, but it changed the shape of the emptiness. Graham asked whether she wanted to stop. Phoebe shook her head, but she did not immediately choose another letter. Instead, she asked why he had agreed to come to my parents' barbecue. That was when I understood she had been holding a different kind of embarrassment since we left the house. She had chosen the place, not the cruelty, not Monica, not the plywood board or Taryn's words. The family around it. When Phoebe first told me she was ready to meet Graham in person, I had offered several quiet options. My office, a private room at the library, a park she liked. She rejected all of them. The barbecue had already been on the calendar, and she said she wanted the meeting to happen near the end of it. At the time, her reason sounded simple. She wanted people she knew nearby. Sitting in the reading room, she admitted the rest. She had imagined getting scared when Graham arrived. She thought that if Grandpa was at the grill, Grandma was in the kitchen, and her cousins were somewhere in the yard, she would still be in a place where everybody knew her. She had believed that familiarity would make meeting a stranger who might be her father feel less like stepping off the edge of something. She had also asked me not to tell my family who was coming. That had not been a test. Phoebe hated being discussed before she entered a room. She did not want my parents preparing speeches, or Monica turning the afternoon into an event. She wanted to meet Graham before everyone else decided what the meeting meant. Instead, she had spent the hour before his arrival learning exactly what some of them thought she meant. Graham listened without interrupting. His eyes moved once to the wheelchair, then back to Phoebe's face. There were several things he could have said about Monica. I saw them collect behind the muscles tightening along his jaw. He said none of them. I was grateful. Phoebe did not need a powerful man to tell her my sister was cruel. She had already lived that part. What she needed from Graham was harder. She needed him not to make the worst moment of her afternoon the center of their first one together. He seemed to understand. He told her only that he was sorry the place she had chosen to feel safe had not protected her. Phoebe ran one thumb over the folded first letter. For the first time, she looked directly into his eyes for more than a second. Something shifted in the room. It was not trust yet, but it was enough permission for the next question. She wanted to know whether he had always known she existed. Graham answered yes. The word landed differently than I expected. Phoebe's fingers stopped moving. I knew the question behind the question because she had asked versions of it throughout childhood. Did my mother know where I went? Did anyone look? Was there somebody who could have come? Children do not need adult vocabulary to understand abandonment. They simply gather what is missing and build explanations around themselves. Graham told her he had known about her from the beginning, and that there had been a time when he had known the sound of her crying before Lena did. Then life between him and Lena had broken apart in ways he would explain when Phoebe wanted the full story. Lena moved. Contact became difficult. Later, after the accident, information became something else entirely. He stopped there. The locked files, conflicting names, and old reports did not belong in this first hour. Phoebe only needed one truth at a time. Graham had known she existed. He had looked for her. And at some point, he had been told something that made him believe he had lost her forever. The librarian in me was already arranging dates, records, and source documents into a chronology. But I was sitting there first as Phoebe's mother. The difference became painfully clear when she smiled at something Graham said about the first letter. It was a tiny smile. Still, it cut somewhere I had not expected. I had promised Phoebe years earlier that if she ever wanted to search for her biological family, I would help. I had meant it every time. I had believed love meant leaving every door unlocked for her, even the doors that might lead away from me. It was easier to believe that before somebody was standing on the other side. Graham could offer resources my library salary never could. Easier access, specialists without waiting lists, opportunities I could not manufacture. The comparison embarrassed me because Phoebe was not looking at any of that. She was looking at the first birthday letter. Still, one frightened part of me whispered a question I hated hearing. If he could give her so much, what would be left that only I could give? I pushed the thought away before it could change the way I moved or spoke. Phoebe deserved this moment without having to carry my fear inside it. Graham reached toward the box, then stopped before touching the envelopes again. He told her some of the letters had been written when he still believed he would find her quickly. Others came later. Phoebe looked down the row. Her fingers moved over the numbered corners without opening them. 5, 6, 7, she paused. I saw her eyes narrow at the date written beneath one number. The reunification advocate had given us a rough timeline during the previous week. There was a point in Graham's search when the records abruptly changed. A point after which his efforts, at least on paper, became far less active. Phoebe had remembered. She pulled one envelope slightly forward and checked its date again. Then another. Several were written later. Much later. Graham's face changed before she even asked. Until that moment, he had been holding himself with the careful control of a man terrified of making the wrong move. Now his shoulders lowered. His eyes drifted toward the table. He told Phoebe that after years of searching, he had eventually been given information that led him to believe she had died in the same crash that killed Lena. The sentence left the room colder. Phoebe did not react immediately. Her gaze fell to the envelopes again. I watched her count the dates. The first letter she had read belonged to Hope, but several of the others had been written after Hope, according to everything Graham had just told us, should have ended. Phoebe touched one of those envelopes with the tip of her finger. Then why are there so many after that? Phoebe's fingertip remained on the envelope, long after the question left her mouth. Graham did not answer immediately. The air system hummed behind the wall, and somewhere deeper in the library, a timer clicked before one row of overhead lights dimmed automatically. 11 envelopes lay between us like a calendar built from absence. Until that moment, I had thought of them as proof that Graham had searched for Phoebe. Now their dates created a different problem. If he had truly believed she was dead, then every letter written afterward had been addressed to someone he never expected to read it. Graham finally explained that writing had become the one part of searching he could continue after every practical avenue had closed. In the earlier years, the letters had been written with destinations in mind. He imagined giving them to Phoebe when he found her, perhaps all at once, perhaps one at a time. After the information about the crash convinced him she was gone, the habit should have ended. It did not. Her birthday would arrive, and he would find himself measuring another year that had happened without her. Eventually, he stopped pretending the letters were part of an investigation. They became a place to put the things he could no longer send anywhere. Phoebe listened without moving the envelope beneath her finger. She did not ask him to prove that grief. The box itself was already doing more than any speech could have done. Several envelopes had softened at the corners, from being handled repeatedly. One had a faint coffee-colored mark near the bottom. Another had been sealed with a strip of clear tape after the original adhesive loosened. These were not papers somebody had prepared during the previous week to impress a child. They had aged with him. Phoebe chose an earlier letter next, one written when Graham still believed finding her was only a matter of time. She asked if she could keep the first one beside her while she read. Graham nodded, and I watched her place the old sheet carefully near her elbow, as though moving it too far away might undo what it had told her. The second letter carried less grief. I could see that before she finished the first paragraph. Phoebe's shoulders loosened, and once the corner of her mouth lifted. She did not read the words aloud, but afterwards she told me that Graham had described the apartment where he and Lena had once lived. He remembered a cracked yellow lamp Lena refused to replace because its light was soft enough to use when Phoebe woke at night. He remembered how Phoebe had gripped his index finger with both hands when she was still small enough to fit against one arm. He had written about searching as though it were temporary, frustrating but solvable. In that version of his life, he still believed the world would eventually hand his daughter back. That confidence made the later envelopes harder to look at. Graham did not push her toward them. He began explaining the search only after Phoebe asked how long he had kept looking. Most of what followed could have filled hours if he had recited every phone call, investigator, and failed lead. Instead, he gave us the shape of it. Lena had left with Phoebe after their relationship ended. Communication became irregular. Then an accident entered the story, records fractured across counties, and the name Graham had been searching began producing fewer and fewer useful results. He had hired investigators, requested records, followed addresses, appealed closed leads, and kept returning to the same name, Phoebe Hart. It was the name on her earliest records, and on the paternity acknowledgement Graham had signed before Lena left with her, months before Phoebe's first birthday. It was the name he carried through nearly every search. At first, I listened as Phoebe's mother. Then, the librarian in me started arranging what I heard into columns. Names, dates, agencies. The last confirmed address, the crash, the point where one paper trail stopped. The point where Graham's investigators began getting answers that looked definitive enough to close doors. The reports our advocate had shown me made persistence look tidy. A date, an agency, a result. Graham's account supplied the blank spaces. He had searched harder in some years than others, relied on investigators when exhaustion took over, and eventually accepted conclusions he had once fought while still paying for periodic checks. The imperfection made his account more believable than any claim that he had searched with the same intensity every day. Phoebe seemed to understand it too. She was quiet for a while, then her eyes dropped toward her own legs. Her hands rested flat on the armrests of her chair. I knew the question before she asked it. She had asked me versions of it in other forms over the years. Would somebody have chosen me if they had known? Would they still have wanted me after the hospital? Did people leave because I became harder? This time she asked Graham, "Did you know I couldn't walk?" His face tightened. He told her no. Whatever information had eventually reached him about the crash had never given him a true picture of the child who survived it. Phoebe rubbed one thumb against the seam of her jeans. She looked at him directly. "Would you still have looked for me?" Graham's answer came without the hesitation that had marked almost everything else he said that afternoon. "I wasn't looking for a child who could walk. I was looking for you." Phoebe looked down again. She did not cry. Graham did not reach for her. That restraint saved the moment from becoming something performed. I watched the muscles around her mouth loosen first. Then her hands, which had been gripping the armrests, opened. The change was small enough that somebody who did not know her might have missed it. To me, it felt enormous. For years, other people had made Phoebe's body the first sentence of every calculation. Stairs, time, help, inconvenience. Monica had taken that logic to its ugliest conclusion at the barbecue. Graham had not pretended the wheelchair was irrelevant. He had simply refused to make it a condition of wanting his daughter. The silence after that answer lasted long enough for the building around us to become noticeable again. Dust floated through a beam of late sunlight near the blinds. Phoebe traced the edge of the first letter with one fingernail. Graham looked toward the box but seemed afraid to choose anything for her. Then, perhaps because doing nothing felt unbearable, he began talking about things he could change. The offers began practically specialists, adaptive equipment, transportation, accessibility consultants. But his mind quickly converted each obstacle into something that could be funded or scheduled. Solving problems was simply the language he knew best. I stopped him before the list grew. Phoebe had already spent years being examined through the lens of what might be corrected or made easier. She did not need her first afternoon with her biological father to become a review of everything in her life that a billionaire could upgrade. I told Graham there would be time for practical conversations later, if Phoebe wanted them. For now, the letters were enough. He sat back. For 1 second, irritation flashed across his face. Not at me exactly, but at the helplessness of having resources and being told they were not the answer. Then it disappeared. He looked at Phoebe and apologized for moving too fast. She shrugged in the way children do when they are willing to let an adult recover without making the recovery comfortable. It was the first small mistake I saw Graham make with her. It was also the first one I saw him correct. Phoebe returned to the box. Her fingers passed over the numbered envelopes again. She skipped several and stopped at 7. The paper was cream-colored, darker along the fold. When she lifted it out, Graham's breathing changed enough that I noticed. He did not tell her not to read it. Phoebe opened the envelope. The letter was longer than the first. She read slowly, pausing twice, and going back over a line. I kept my eyes on the grain of the table rather than on her face. There are moments when watching someone too closely becomes another demand. Eventually, she pushed the page toward me. Only then did I read the section she had marked with her finger. Graham had written about an airport. He had been walking through a terminal after a business trip when he saw a little girl several yards ahead, with dark hair, the same color Phoebe's had been, in the old photographs. For a few seconds, he followed her, not running, not calling out, just walking too quickly behind a stranger because hope had outrun reason. Then the child turned toward the man beside her and took his hand. She was not Phoebe. Graham wrote that he had stopped beside a bank of windows and watched planes move across the runway until he could trust himself to walk again. The letter did not say much more about it. It did not need to. Phoebe read that paragraph twice. Her eyes lifted toward Graham, and something in the way she looked at him changed. Until then, she had been trying to decide whether he belonged to her past. The airport story made him feel less like evidence and more like a person who had carried a missing child into ordinary places. Airports, birthdays, hotel rooms, workdays. Places where grief had no reason to appear and appeared anyway. She folded the letter carefully. I thought again about the barbecue. Less than 2 hours earlier, Phoebe had been made to feel as though her presence cost too much. Now she was reading proof that somewhere else, somebody had spent years wishing for the inconvenience of having her there. The contrast hurt in a way satisfaction could not soften. Graham asked whether she wanted to take the box home. Phoebe looked at me before answering. I could tell she wanted the letters near her, but did not want the responsibility of deciding everything at once. I suggested we keep them in the locked cabinet in my office, until she chose which one to read next. She agreed. Graham did too. That simple arrangement seemed to calm all three of us. It gave the letters a place. It gave Phoebe control over time. And, selfishly, it gave me something I could do that did not involve competing with a billionaire or solving an 11-year mystery. I could keep a box safe until my daughter wanted it. By late afternoon, the room had darkened enough that the automatic lights came fully on again. Graham eventually left after Phoebe decided she had had enough for one day. He did not ask for a hug. He did not ask when she would call him. He only confirmed through me that any next step would happen when she was ready. Phoebe watched through the front windows as his car pulled away. On the drive home, she said very little. She held the first birthday letter inside a clear plastic sleeve I had found in my office. Every few miles, she looked down at it again, not reading, only checking that it was still there. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with copies of the records I had already received. I was not trying to solve the entire mystery. The reunification advocate had warned me that sealed dependency records and old county systems could take time to untangle, but Graham's description of searching almost exclusively for Phoebe Hart would not leave me alone. I went back through the pages from Phoebe's foster intake. Most of them contained the kind of information I had seen dozens of times during the adoption process: placement dates, school records, medical summaries, notes about previous addresses. I had read those documents so often that I thought I knew every error in them. Then I found a page from an early intake transfer. The surname stopped me. Phoebe Price. I leaned closer, convinced fatigue had rearranged the letters. It had not. The first name was hers. The birth date matched. The medical history matched the child sleeping down the hall. But the surname was Price. I turned back to the copy of her certified birth record lying beneath Graham's search summary. Phoebe Hart. 2 names. 2 paper trails. And Graham Sterling had spent years searching only one of them. The name Price stayed on my kitchen table until almost midnight. I had placed the foster intake sheet beside Phoebe's certified birth record and the copy of the old paternity acknowledgement. The birth record named her Phoebe Hart and left the father field blank. The separate hospital document carried Graham Sterling's signature. The intake transfer, with the same birth date and early medical history, belonged to Phoebe Price. I had seen the second surname before. That was the part that bothered me most. During the adoption process, I had read hundreds of pages, written by people who had known Phoebe only in fragments. Social workers changed. Hospitals abbreviated names. Addresses appeared twice with slightly different dates. One record listed the wrong school grade. Another misspelled Lena's middle name. By the time Phoebe came to me at 7, I had learned to treat small inconsistencies as the debris left behind when a child moved through too many systems. I had assumed Price was one of them. Now Graham's search reports were sitting 6 inches away, all built around the name Hart. I closed the folder before the questions carried me too far ahead of what we actually knew. The next morning, Phoebe found me at the table with the papers stacked neatly beside my coffee. She looked at the top sheet, then at my face. I could tell from the way she slowed her chair that she knew I had found something. I told her about the second surname, without turning it into a theory. I showed her the intake page and the birth record, and explained that I did not yet know why both existed. She read them carefully, touching the printed names with one finger, as though checking whether either felt more familiar. Neither did. For most of her remembered life, she had been Phoebe Frost. The other names belonged to years she knew, mostly through documents. I expected her to ask what price meant. Instead, she looked toward the hallway closet, where we kept the old keepsake box that had followed her through foster care. That box had always occupied an awkward place in our house. I had never hidden it, but I had not encouraged her to open it often either. When Phoebe first came to live with me, she was 7, and already carrying more history than she could explain. The caseworker had handed me a cardboard archive box containing school papers, 2 photographs, several medical wristbands, a knitted cap she had long outgrown, and a handful of objects nobody had been able to identify. I told myself I was protecting her by waiting until she was older. Looking back, I had also been protecting myself from questions I did not know how to answer. Phoebe asked for the box. We brought it into the living room and set it on the low table where she could reach everything without leaning too far. Dust had gathered along one edge of the lid. When I lifted it, the faint smell of old paper rose from inside. Phoebe began sorting through the contents more slowly than she had the first time we opened it years earlier. She recognized the hospital wristbands. One carried the name Phoebe Price in block letters. Another used only her first name and date of birth. There was a folded photograph of Lena, younger than I had ever seen her in the records, standing beside a man whose face now required no explanation. Graham. The photograph had been bent across the middle so many times that a white line divided them at the shoulders. Near the bottom of the box lay the small metal charm that had started everything. It was no larger than a quarter. Age had darkened the recessed parts of the design, but the raised emblem was still visible, a stylized bridge crossing 2 narrow lines. I had assumed for years that it belonged to a school, a hospital, or perhaps a charity event Lena had attended. Phoebe picked it up and rolled it between her fingers. Then she told me she had known what it was for months. The confession arrived so quietly that I nearly missed its weight. She had searched the symbol one evening after I went to bed. An image result led her to the Sterling Foundation. From there, she found archived photographs of charity events. One of them showed Graham beside Lena. She had stared at that photograph long enough to notice things I had not noticed until after someone told me to look. Graham's eyebrows, Lena's jaw, Phoebe's face divided between them in ways that were subtle until they were impossible not to see. She kept searching. Not every night, not obsessively. She said she would go several weeks without looking, then return to the same pages. Sometimes she cleared the browser history afterward. Other times, she closed the tablet as soon as she heard me walking down the hall. I sat beside her and listened. There was no investigator's brilliance in what she had done. No secret database, no improbable deduction. An 11-year-old girl had taken a strange emblem from an old box, typed what she could describe into a search bar, and followed pictures until one of them looked like a piece of herself. That simplicity made the months she had kept it private harder to understand. I asked only one direct question. "Why didn't you tell me?" Phoebe looked back into the box. Her fingers found the edge of the folded photograph, but she did not open it again. She said she had wanted to. Then she admitted what had stopped her. She was afraid I would think she wanted another family. The words were simple. The damage behind them was not. Phoebe had worried that searching for Graham meant being dissatisfied with me. She had imagined telling me she wanted to know her biological father and seeing something change in my face. She worried I might think the expensive houses and photographs attached to the Sterling name had become more important than the home we had built together. Most painfully, she had worried that mothers could be replaced. I looked around our living room while she spoke. The bookshelf beside the window leaned slightly because we had assembled it ourselves and refused to start over when we discovered the floor was uneven. One of Phoebe's astronomy posters hung crooked above the sofa. Her sneakers were beside the door, even though she rarely wore them outside anymore. She liked the way they looked, and had insisted they still belonged with the other shoes. This was home. I had believed that was obvious. Apparently, I had not always made it safe enough to question what came before it. I remembered all the times Phoebe asked about Lena when she was younger, and I answered carefully, then changed the subject before the questions became too painful. I remembered telling myself I was giving her a normal childhood instead of forcing her to live inside a tragedy. I had never forbidden her from talking about her biological family. I had simply become so good at protecting her from difficult conversations that she had learned which doors I rarely opened. The realization did not need a speech. I closed the folder of records and moved it aside. I told her that wanting to know where she came from did not erase where she had come home to. Phoebe's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back with the stubbornness she had inherited from nobody I knew. I did not ask her to reassure me. That mattered. It would have been easy to turn the moment around and make her tell me I was still her mother. Easy to ask whether she loved me, whether the Sterling name changed anything, whether she wanted a different life. Those questions belonged to my fear, not hers. So I kept them. Phoebe leaned against my arm for a few seconds. Then, in the ordinary way children rescue adults from emotional moments, she picked up the hospital wristband and asked why it said Price. That brought us back to the papers. During the next several days, the reunification advocate helped us organize what could be verified without opening sealed dependency files. She did not hand us a dramatic answer. What emerged was a sequence of small facts, each unimpressive by itself. Phoebe had been born Hart. Later records connected Lena to Price, a surname she had begun using socially during a later period of her life. No other adult had established parental rights over Phoebe. Some institutions recorded the child under that surname as well. After the crash, emergency treatment followed the name on the documents traveling with her, and hospital and rehabilitation records used Price more consistently than Hart. By then, the formal review had also authenticated Graham's old paternity acknowledgement and the supporting hospital records. Because that document had never entered the later dependency case, and the vital record itself named no legally established father, the adoption file had proceeded under the unknown father process reflected in its records. Graham made clear through counsel that he would not challenge my completed adoption. Whatever the biological truth reopened, Phoebe was not about to be turned into a custody fight. The foster intake had not invented a second child. It had continued a second paper identity, while Graham's search stayed centered on Phoebe Hart. That explained how two trails might miss each other, but not yet why Graham had been told she died or why nobody later reconnected the records. Those answers still sat behind files we had not fully reconstructed. What we could finally see was simpler. Phoebe had not vanished. Her history had split Hart on the trail Graham followed, Price through hospital, rehabilitation, and dependency care. I laid the pages side by side on the floor. Phoebe rolled closer and looked down at them. 2 surnames, 1 birthday, 1 child. She stared for a long time at the hospital wristband. The plastic had yellowed slightly, and the ink was fading at the edges. It was strange to think that something so flimsy might have helped carry a name through years of paperwork. The sterling charm sat beside it. I asked Phoebe whether she remembered where the charm came from. She did not. Her earliest memories after the crash were disconnected. Ceiling lights, a television mounted high on a wall, the sound of rubber soles in hospital corridors, a nurse who braided her hair too tightly. She remembered being told her mother was gone, but not the exact room or the person who said it. She remembered rehabilitation in pieces, mostly through sensations, the rough fabric of transfer belts, the smell of disinfectant, the frustration of adults praising movements that felt impossible to her. The charm had simply always been among her things. For years it had meant nothing. Now it had become a bridge between two histories. That evening, Graham came to the library after closing, not to see Phoebe, but to deliver copies of several older documents our advocate had requested. He did not stay long. I told him we had found the Price surname and watched his expression change. He knew Lena had used Price for a period of her life. He had not known Phoebe's records had followed it. That was another small difference between what seemed obvious now and what had been visible then. People often imagine missing person searches as enormous nets thrown across every possible name and place. The reality, sitting on my desk, looked narrower. Investigators followed the information they had. Databases returned what matched. Each unanswered request pushed them toward the conclusion already forming around the crash. Graham looked older when I told him that. He did not blame an investigator or agency. Not yet. He simply stared at the photocopied wristband, as if a single word printed on plastic had spent 11 years standing on the other side of a locked door. Before he left, he asked whether Phoebe wanted another letter. I told him she would decide. He nodded. The following afternoon, she did. We returned to the small reading room where the wooden box was stored in my locked cabinet. I set it on the table and stepped back. Phoebe lifted the lid. This time, she did not touch the earliest envelopes. She searched the dates until she found the birthday closest to the year of the crash. The envelope looked different from the hopeful first letter. The handwriting on the front was less even. One corner had been bent and straightened again. Phoebe held it for several seconds. Then she asked me to sit beside her while she opened it. That request tightened something in my chest. She did not want privacy for this one. Whatever the letter contained, she wanted one hand in her old life while she reached into the one she had lost. I moved my chair beside hers. She broke the seal carefully. The paper inside was covered on both sides. Phoebe read the first line and stopped. I saw her eyes move over it again. Her breathing became shallow. She handed me the page without speaking. The sentence at the top had been written by a man who, at the time, believed there was nobody left alive to read it. Graham had begun the letter by saying that he had just been told his daughter was dead. The first sentence of Graham's letter sat between Phoebe and me, like something too heavy for paper. He had written it only days after being told that his daughter had died. Phoebe did not ask me to keep reading. She took the page back and held it with both hands, careful not to crease it beyond the folds that were already there. I watched her eyes move slowly across the lines. Every few sentences she stopped, not because the handwriting was difficult, but because the meaning seemed to require more room than the page could give it. Graham had not written about funerals or dramatic promises. He had written about ordinary things that suddenly had nowhere to go. He wondered whether Phoebe would have liked strawberries as much as Lena did. He remembered buying a small book years earlier, because he thought he would read it to her when he found her. He admitted that he had kept one of her baby socks in a drawer for so long that he could no longer explain why throwing it away felt impossible. The letter had been written to a child he believed would never read it. That changed everything about the words. There was nothing to gain from them when he wrote them. No reconciliation, no forgiveness, no possibility that Phoebe would someday look across a table and judge whether he sounded sincere enough. He had written because her birthday still existed, even when, according to the information he had been given, she did not. Phoebe reached the bottom of the second page and stopped. Her face remained lowered. One tear landed near the edge of the paper, and she wiped it away quickly with the side of her thumb, as if she were protecting the letter rather than herself. I put my hand on the table close to hers without touching her. She moved her fingers toward mine. That was how we stayed for a while. The mystery that had shaped so much of Phoebe's childhood was no longer asking only where her father had been. It was beginning to ask how two people could spend years grieving each other while both were still alive. Our reunification advocate helped us finish assembling the answer over the next several days. There was no single villain hiding behind it. I almost wished there had been. One cruel decision would have been easier to understand than a chain of ordinary failures. Lena was using Price socially by the time of the crash, so emergency treatment followed the name on the documents traveling with Phoebe. Lena died. Phoebe survived with injuries that required months of hospital care and rehabilitation. During a later data transfer, a fatality closure was attached to an external locator, index entry under Phoebe Hart, associated with Lena's crash. It was not placed on the live medical and dependency file being maintained under Phoebe Price. To outside searchers following Hart, the closure looked official. Inside the care system, the living child continued through rehabilitation and dependency services under Price. When her case moved between counties, those juvenile records became sealed and difficult for outside investigators to cross-match. Graham's investigators were following Phoebe Hart, the name carried by her earliest records, and his signed paternity acknowledgement. The Hart locator trail appeared to end at the fatal crash, while the Price care trail continued. The two histories belonged to the same child, but the systems around them never joined them back together. By the time somebody eventually supplied Graham's investigators with the closure information tied to the crash, years of failed searches had already worn away the certainty that had kept him pushing. His people continued checking databases after that. Graham continued paying for searches longer than most people would have known. But the information they were checking was built around a child called Phoebe Hart. The child who survived was moving through the world as Phoebe Price. Later, she became Phoebe Frost. I sat at my dining table with the documents spread in front of me. Each step had looked reasonable in isolation. One name entered at the hospital, another indexed for an outside search, a county migration, then a sealed juvenile file. Because Graham's unfiled paternity acknowledgement never followed Phoebe into dependency court, the adoption record had treated her father as legally unidentified. Inside those ordinary-looking gaps, a father mourned a daughter who was alive, and a child entered foster care believing nobody had come. Phoebe asked whether someone should have noticed. I told her the truth. Yes. I also told her that knowing where the chain broke now did not mean every person who touched a file had known what we knew looking backward. That distinction mattered because I did not want her building a new life around hatred for strangers, whose names she would never know. She had already carried enough explanations that ended with someone failing her. What she needed now was to understand that Graham's absence had not been a choice. That truth finally settled fully several evenings later, when he came to the library and sat with us in the same reading room. Phoebe brought the letter written after the crash. She had read it twice more at home. This time she asked Graham about the years after it. Not every detail. She wanted to know why he kept writing once he believed she was gone. Graham explained that her birthday became a date he could not treat like any other. He had kept working, traveling and living, rather than spending 11 years frozen in grief. But each year he still wrote because he could not let the daughter he believed dead disappear completely. The honesty seemed to help Phoebe more than a claim of perfect, unbroken mourning would have. Phoebe looked down at her legs after that. I knew what was coming because the question had not truly left her after their first meeting. The crash had taken Lena and changed Phoebe's body, and the barbecue had given voice to her old fear that those changes made her harder to want. She asked what kind of daughter Graham had imagined finding. He admitted he had pictured countless possibilities. Older, angry, perhaps unable to remember him, but never the exact child in front of him, because there had been no way to know her. Phoebe touched one wheel. Graham did not repeat a speech about disability. His earlier answer had already said enough. He had been searching for Phoebe. This time, she let the silence remain peaceful. A few days later, she surprised me at breakfast by asking whether Graham might want to come to her school science night. Phoebe had spent 6 weeks working on a small astronomy presentation about how astronomers identify exoplanets by measuring changes in a star's brightness. She had talked about it so often that I could explain the basic idea despite having forgotten most of the science I learned in high school. Science night had always been ours. I helped carry display boards. Phoebe complained about my inability to cut straight lines. We ate something terrible from a vending machine afterward, and rated every project according to an entirely unofficial system involving effort, glitter, and likelihood of accidental explosion. When she asked about Graham, something inside me contracted before I could stop it. The reaction embarrassed me. Phoebe was not asking to replace me. She was asking to add someone. Still, I could already picture him standing beside us beneath the fluorescent lights, occupying a place that had always belonged only to the two of us. I kept that feeling where it belonged, with me. I told her I thought he would want to come. Then I did the harder thing. I contacted him myself. Graham arrived at the school without an assistant, security spectacle, or anything that announced his wealth. He wore an ordinary dark jacket and stood near the back until Phoebe spotted him. Her face changed. That was the moment that hurt and healed me at the same time. She brightened. Not more than she did when she saw me. Differently. I had spent years believing love was safest when I could measure it by what only I provided. Graham's arrival was beginning to teach me something I was not yet ready to admit. Phoebe could gain a relationship without reducing ours. The evening itself exposed how little Graham actually knew about being part of her daily life. He did not know which side she preferred people to approach from in crowded rooms. He nearly put a hand on the back of her chair when someone blocked the aisle, then caught himself before touching it. He had no idea that Phoebe hated grape-flavored drinks or that she became quiet, not talkative, when nervous before presenting. I knew all of those things. There was no triumph in that knowledge, just history. Graham watched me offer Phoebe a bottle of water without asking if she needed help opening it. He noticed when I shifted one display board because the corner blocked her line of sight. He saw her tap the side of my hand twice, before rolling toward the presentation area, a small ritual she had used since elementary school when she wanted reassurance without being fussed over. He was learning a language I had been speaking for years. When Phoebe presented, Graham stood several feet behind me. She explained the dimming of distant stars with more confidence than she had shown at breakfast. Halfway through, she glanced toward us. First me, then Graham, she continued. That tiny movement lodged somewhere beneath my ribs. Afterward, Graham did not offer to fund a science lab or buy equipment for the school. Perhaps he had begun learning already. He simply listened while Phoebe described which parts had gone wrong and which teacher had asked the best question. His attention stayed on things money could not improve. On the drive home, Phoebe talked more than she had in days. She said Graham had looked lost near the cafeteria and found this hilarious. She wondered whether he had understood half of her presentation. She decided he probably had because he asked about one of the graphs afterward. Her voice carried the loose, satisfied energy she usually had after something went well. I was glad. I was also relieved when we reached home, and it was only the two of us again. That relief was the part I could not forgive myself for. Phoebe called Graham later to thank him for coming. I went to the kitchen while she spoke from her room. I did not listen to the conversation, but the house was small enough that I heard her laugh once through the hallway. I stood at the sink with both hands beneath running water, long after the glass I was washing was clean. The records had answered the question I thought mattered most. Graham had not abandoned her. He had not known she survived. He had spent years searching the wrong paper trail, and then years writing to a daughter he believed he had lost forever. The mystery should have made everything easier. Instead, it opened a fear I had been able to avoid while he remained only a name on a birth certificate. Graham was real now. So was his love for Phoebe. So were his resources, his history with Lena, and every future experience he might be able to give her. I looked toward the hallway. Phoebe laughed again, softer this time. For years I had promised her that if we ever found the people she came from, I would not stand in the way. Now we had found one of them. And for the first time, I understood that keeping that promise might require more courage than making it had. After science night, Graham stopped feeling like a visitor who had entered our lives through a locked door and started becoming something more difficult to define. He was not family in the way Phoebe understood me to be family. Not yet. But he was no longer a stranger either. He began appearing in the spaces between important events, which turned out to matter more than any dramatic reunion could have. Some afternoons he met us at the library after school. Other times, he joined us for a quick meal at the small diner, 2 blocks from my apartment, because Phoebe liked the booths near the front windows. The first few visits were full of small mistakes. Graham once moved behind her chair when someone squeezed past the table and instinctively placed his hand near one handle. He stopped before touching it. Phoebe noticed. She raised one eyebrow, and he pulled his hand back as though he had almost touched a hot stove. He began asking before doing things. Not perfectly, but enough that I could see the effort. He learned that Phoebe preferred opening heavy doors herself if there was room to position her chair correctly. He learned that she hated grape-flavored anything and would accept orange only if no better option existed. He learned that astronomy was not a temporary school obsession. She could talk for 20 minutes about planets and then become annoyed if an adult called her "our little scientist" in the voice people used for kindergartners. He also learned that she did not want every conversation to return to the crash. Some days, she wanted to know about Lena. Other days, she wanted to complain about a math worksheet or show Graham a ridiculous video of a dog wearing goggles. I watched him adjust. At first, he treated every piece of information as something to store and use. I could almost see the executive machinery working behind his eyes. Phoebe mentioned a difficult doorway, and Graham remembered it. She complained about a poorly positioned desk, and he filed it away. She mentioned that transferring into one of the school's older laboratory stools was awkward, and his attention sharpened in a way I had already learned to recognize. The problem was that Graham did not simply remember obstacles. He wanted to remove them. The first time this became more than a personality quirk happened at Phoebe's school. A week after science night, she came home irritated because one of the science rooms used for a new unit had narrow spacing between fixed lab tables. The teacher had arranged an alternate station for her near the door. Phoebe could participate, but the placement separated her slightly from the other students. She described it as annoying rather than devastating. Mostly she disliked that everyone had to turn around whenever she spoke. I listened while she ate apple slices at the kitchen table. Graham happened to call later that evening, and Phoebe mentioned the room in passing. By the next afternoon, he had already started moving. He contacted someone who understood accessibility design. He spoke with the school administration. By the time he told me what he had done, the idea had expanded from one crowded science room into a possible donation for adjustable lab stations, door modifications, and updated equipment. On paper, it was generous. That was precisely why stopping him felt complicated. I found out because he sent me a summary before anything was finalized. He was proud of himself for not making the changes without telling us. From his perspective, that was restraint. I read the proposal twice at my desk in the library. It was thoughtful, expensive, professionally prepared, and Phoebe had not asked for any of it. I called him after closing and explained that the problem was not whether the school could benefit from better equipment. It probably could. The problem was that he had heard one frustration from Phoebe and immediately built a solution around her, without asking whether she wanted to become the reason a major donor appeared at her school. Graham was quiet for a moment. I could tell he was trying to understand why solving an obvious problem might be wrong. He said the changes would help other students too. That was true. I reminded him that the question was not whether his idea was good. It was whether Phoebe had been included in deciding what happened because of something she had shared about her own life. I kept the next word simple. Ask her. The silence on the phone changed. Graham was used to turning obstacles into projects, and 11 years of helplessness made speed feel like love. Now that Phoebe was within reach, his instinct was to make up for lost time by moving faster than she needed. The next evening, Graham came to our apartment and explained what he had started. He did not present the proposal or show her the cost. He simply told her he had heard about the science room and moved too quickly because he thought fixing it would help. Phoebe listened while turning a pencil between her fingers. Then he asked what she actually wanted. Her answer was much smaller than his plan. She wanted one adjustable height table placed with the other students rather than near the doorway. She wanted enough space between two fixed stations to turn without backing into someone. She did not want a new wing, a plaque, or anyone making an announcement about who paid for anything. Graham nodded. The large proposal disappeared. A much narrower solution remained. I watched something in him soften as he accepted that the best gift he could give was not the biggest one available. A few days later, Phoebe came home pleased because the school had agreed to rearrange one section immediately while considering broader accessibility improvements through its normal process. Graham did not ask whether his name would be attached to anything. He asked Phoebe whether the new position felt better. It was quiet progress, and Phoebe noticed it. My own progress was harder to measure. There was a Saturday ritual Phoebe and I had kept, almost since she first came to live with me. Once a month, if my work schedule allowed it, we stayed late at the library after closing, ordered takeout, and used the public astronomy database on the large monitor in the community room. Phoebe would choose an object in the sky, and we would see how much we could learn about it before the food got cold. The ritual had begun during a difficult winter when she was 8. She had been waking from dreams about the crash, though she rarely remembered enough to describe them. On one of those nights, I showed her photographs taken by a space telescope because she said she wanted to see something farther away than everything bad. The Saturday evenings became ours. For years, I had never considered inviting anyone else. After science night, Phoebe mentioned that Graham had asked what we did on weekends. She told him about our library nights, then stopped as if she had revealed something private. I knew what she was not asking. I also knew what it would cost me to answer. The next library night was already marked on our calendar. I sent Graham the time. I did not invite him for the whole evening. That would have felt like handing over something before either Phoebe or I was ready. I told him he could join us for the first hour if Phoebe still wanted him there. She did. When he arrived, he brought no gift. I later learned he had almost brought a high-end telescope until some new instinct warned him against it. Instead, he brought 3 paper cups of hot chocolate from the place Phoebe liked. He had remembered hers without whipped cream. That tiny detail affected me more than I wanted it to. We spent the hour looking at images of Saturn and one distant nebula Phoebe had chosen because she liked its name. Graham knew less astronomy than I expected from someone who ran a company built around logistics and infrastructure. Phoebe took visible pleasure in correcting him. I sat beside them and felt 2 opposite things at once. I missed the shape the evening used to have. I liked the new shape too. Both were true. When Graham left after the agreed hour, he did not try to extend the visit. Phoebe watched him go, then returned to the screen and told me his understanding of orbital periods was embarrassing. The old ritual resumed, but it had changed, not because Graham had taken something from it, because I had opened one small part of it and discovered there was still enough left for me. That lesson should have made me more generous about family. Instead, Monica reminded me why generosity without judgment could become another form of self-betrayal. Her first message arrived 3 days later. I had expected anger from her after the barbecue. Perhaps accusations that I had humiliated her by bringing Graham without warning. Instead, she waited. When she finally wrote, the tone was so careful that I read the message twice. She apologized for the barbecue. Not specifically enough to satisfy me, but more directly than I expected. She said she had been stressed, that Taryn's comment had embarrassed her, and that she had reacted badly. She said she wanted the cousins to have another chance. I did not answer immediately. A second message arrived the following day. This one referred to Graham. Monica said she hoped he understood that the barbecue did not represent our family at its best. She mentioned how wonderful it must be for Phoebe to reconnect with someone who could open so many doors for her. The phrase stayed with me, open so many doors. Before Graham arrived, Monica had spent 3 years treating every literal doorway Phoebe could not enter as an inconvenience. Now she seemed fascinated by the figurative ones her father might open. Her third message made the shift impossible to ignore. She asked whether Taryn and Celia might spend some time with Phoebe and Graham together. She framed it as rebuilding the cousins' relationship. Buried near the end was a reference to the Sterling Foundation and the leadership programs it supported. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. The apology suddenly felt less like remorse and more like an application. Phoebe had not seen the messages yet. I did not intend to hide them forever, but I wanted time to decide which parts belonged to her and which parts were simply Monica trying to pull me back into an old pattern. For years, my sister had relied on one fact. I wanted peace more than she wanted accountability. That equation no longer worked. Graham had not made Phoebe more valuable. His name had only exposed the value Monica assigned to people she thought could offer her something. The difference became even clearer when I compared Monica's messages to Walter's silence. Dad had not apologized yet. He had sent no grand explanation, no attempt to defend himself. I was still angry with him, but at least his quiet felt like shame rather than strategy. Mom, meanwhile, had sent one short message, saying she hoped we could talk when things were calmer. I knew her well enough to hear the rest without reading it. Diane had always believed time could turn an injury into a misunderstanding if everyone waited long enough. I was not ready to help her do that. Phoebe, however, noticed that my phone had begun lighting up more often. She did not ask about Monica. She was busy with Graham, the letters, school, and the strange work of building a relationship with someone who was biologically familiar and emotionally new. For a brief stretch, I let her have that. Graham continued learning. He stopped sending me lists of possible improvements. When Phoebe mentioned a problem, he began asking whether she wanted help solving it or merely wanted someone to hear that it was irritating. The first time he asked that question, she stared at him in mild surprise. Then she told him she was just complaining. He accepted that. I nearly laughed. A billionaire had finally discovered the revolutionary concept that not every problem required a project plan. The humor did not erase what was happening beneath it. Phoebe was beginning to relax around him. Not completely. She still looked toward me when something became emotionally difficult. She still asked me to keep the letterbox at the library. She still came home with me. But she had stopped referring to Graham as Mr. Sterling when she talked about him privately. Now he was simply Graham. That change was enough for the moment. One evening, while I was putting away dishes, my phone vibrated on the counter. I assumed it was Monica again. It was Taryn. She had never messaged me privately before. The first line said she wanted to talk to Phoebe, but she did not know whether Phoebe would answer her. I read the next sentence standing beside the open dishwasher. My hands went cold. Taryn wrote that there was something Phoebe needed to know about the barbecue. Then another message appeared. This one was shorter. Mom told us what to do before Phoebe got there. Taryn's message stayed on my screen while the dishwasher hummed behind me. Mom told us what to do before Phoebe got there. I read it twice before closing the dishwasher with my foot and sitting down at the kitchen table. There were moments when anger arrived hot and obvious. This was not one of them. What I felt was colder. Monica's words at the barbecue had already told me what she believed. Taryn's message suggested something worse. My sister had not merely defended cruelty after hearing it. She had prepared her children to think that way before Phoebe ever rolled into the yard. I did not forward the message to Phoebe immediately. It concerned her, which meant she had a right to know. But the right to know was not the same as being ambushed by information while doing homework at the kitchen counter. I waited until she finished, then told her Taryn had contacted me privately and wanted to explain something about the barbecue. I did not summarize the confession for her. I handed Phoebe the choice first. She went quiet. The old version of me would have filled that silence with advice. I might have told her that hearing Taryn out could help or that cousins should get a chance to repair what they had broken. I had spent too many years quietly steering Phoebe toward reconciliation because I wanted our family to feel intact. This time, I waited. Phoebe asked to see the message. I slid the phone across the table. She read the 2 lines and held it a little longer than necessary. Her face did not change much, but one thumb rubbed the edge of the case until the skin went pale. She decided she wanted to hear what Taryn had to say. Not at my parents' house, not at Monica's, somewhere neutral. We met Taryn and Celia 2 days later at the library after closing, in the same community room where Phoebe and I had spent our astronomy nights. I chose it because the space belonged to Phoebe, in a way my parents' backyard never had. The tables moved easily. The doors were wide. Nobody needed to improvise a path for her after she arrived. Graham did not come. He knew about the meeting, but Phoebe had not asked for him there. I was glad. The presence of a billionaire CEO would have changed the shape of every apology before it was spoken. Taryn looked 13 when she entered the room. That sounds obvious. But at the barbecue, I had seen her mostly through anger. She had stood beside Phoebe repeating an adult cruelty, with the confidence of someone who expected the adults behind her to approve. Now her shoulders curved inward beneath a denim jacket, and she kept checking her phone without turning the screen on. Celia looked worse. Her eyes were swollen before we had even sat down. Neither girl tried to hug Phoebe. That was the first good decision they made. Taryn had brought proof. She unlocked her phone, found the message thread with Monica, and placed it on the table where Phoebe could decide whether to read it. The text had been sent the morning of the barbecue. Monica had reminded Taryn that Caroline would probably expect everyone to make the day about Phoebe again. She told her not to get stuck babysitting, and specifically warned her not to spend the afternoon pushing Phoebe's chair around if Phoebe could not keep up with whatever the other kids wanted to do. There was no misunderstanding in the wording, no missing context that made it kinder. Monica had taken the resentment she carried toward an 11-year-old child and handed it to her daughters as instruction. I watched Phoebe read. She reached the end, scrolled back once, then returned the phone to the table. Taryn did not blame her mother for everything. I respected her for that. She admitted that Monica had planted the idea, but she had still chosen the words she used. She had wanted Celia to laugh. She had known Phoebe would hear. The admission came haltingly, mixed with long stretches where she stared at the floor and forced herself to keep going. Celia's apology was different. She cried almost immediately. She said she had repeated Taryn because that was what she usually did when she wanted her older sister to think she was funny. She kept wiping her cheeks with the cuff of her sleeve until the fabric darkened. Phoebe did not comfort either of them. She listened. That was enough. When the girls finished, she said she was not ready to act like nothing had happened. The sentence was simple and exactly right for her age. Taryn nodded. Celia cried harder but did not ask to be forgiven. The absence of pressure mattered more to me than any polished apology could have. For years, the adults in my family had treated forgiveness as something the injured person was expected to provide, so everyone else could stop feeling uncomfortable. Taryn and Celia, for all their mistakes, were beginning to understand that an apology did not create an obligation on the other side. Phoebe agreed they could text her sometimes. Nothing more. It was a tiny opening, but it was hers. On the drive home, she stared out the window for several blocks before asking whether Monica had always thought about her that way. I could not give her certainty about every year. I told her what I did know. Monica had repeatedly treated accommodations as inconveniences. She had blamed me for choosing a life that required extra planning, and now we had evidence that she had passed those ideas to her daughters. Phoebe's fingers rested loosely on her lap. She got nicer after Graham came. There was no question in her voice. I did not soften it. Yes, she had. That was the wound beneath the barbecue, and naming it did not make it larger. It only stopped us pretending we had imagined it. Monica proved Phoebe right within the week. Her messages to me continued, but their subject shifted further from apology and closer to opportunity. She mentioned that Taryn had begun thinking about future leadership programs. She referred to the Sterling Foundation twice in one message, and then, almost casually, wondered whether Graham ever advised young people interested in business. A day later, Graham forwarded me an email Monica had sent to an address associated with his company. She had introduced herself as Phoebe's aunt. That word looked obscene in context. Monica wrote about the extraordinary reunion our family was experiencing, and then pivoted toward a youth leadership opportunity that might be perfect for Taryn. She implied that the girls and Phoebe were close. Graham did not answer Monica directly. He forwarded the message to me and made clear that anything involving Phoebe would go through Phoebe and me. There was no threat or display of power, which left Monica no way to recast herself as a victim. Her sudden warmth had become transparently transactional. She wanted proximity, and Phoebe was the bridge. The ugliness of that became even clearer when Monica began referring to what had happened as our family miracle in conversations she knew would travel back to us. I did not need social media screenshots or a public confrontation to understand the pattern. Before Graham arrived, Phoebe's needs were too much. After Graham arrived, Phoebe's story became something Monica wanted to stand beside. My father responded differently. Walter had been almost completely silent since the barbecue. At first, I assumed he was waiting for my anger to cool. That had always been my parents' preferred method of conflict resolution. Enough time passed, the sharpest words were forgotten, and eventually, somebody invited everyone to dinner, as if forgetting were the same thing as healing. Then Dad came to the library alone. He waited until my shift ended. When I found him near the front doors, he looked smaller than he had behind the grill that afternoon. His hands were rough and scarred in the familiar places from decades of carpentry. I had watched those hands rebuild half the rooms in the house where I grew up. He did not bring flowers. He did not begin by blaming Monica. Instead, he told me he had started building the ramp. For a moment, I did not know which ramp he meant. Then I pictured the plywood sheet at the back steps. 3 years. Phoebe had visited that house for 3 years, and my father had used scrap lumber to get her over 2 steps while building proper entrances for strangers who paid him. Walter seemed to know exactly what that said about him. He admitted that the worst part was not that he had forgotten, he had noticed every time. He had simply kept deciding it could wait. Phoebe had adapted so efficiently that her adaptation became an excuse for his inaction. The admission hurt more than an excuse would have. He had known. I thought of Phoebe's hands tightening around the wheel rims while he joked about fixing it someday. Dad looked down at his own hands when he said he had no right to ask whether she would use the new ramp. He was building it because it should have been there long ago. I did not forgive him. I also did not tell him to stop. There was a difference between apology and repair. For the first time, Walter seemed willing to do something that might never earn him the result he wanted. He left without asking me to bring Phoebe over. That was the first reason I believed his shame might become something useful. My mother called the next evening. Diane had not changed as much. She said she was glad Walter was fixing the entrance. She said the girls had clearly learned a lesson. Then, slowly and predictably, she began trying to fold Monica back into the family without making Monica carry the full weight of what she had done. Mom said my sister had always been blunt. She said Monica had been embarrassed by Taryn's behavior and reacted badly. She reminded me that sisters said terrible things to each other and eventually found their way back. I listened while wiping the kitchen counter. The motions helped keep me from interrupting. Then Mom said the sentence she had been building toward from the beginning. Monica had not meant it the way I was taking it. I put the cloth down. There had been a time when that sentence could weaken my certainty. Diane had used it throughout my childhood whenever Monica crossed a line. A cruel joke became bad timing. A selfish decision became stress. Intent was always polished until the harm looked accidental. Now, I had Taryn's message. Monica had given instructions before Phoebe arrived. There was nothing accidental left to protect. I told my mother I was no longer interested in translating Monica's behavior into something easier for the family to live with. Diane went quiet. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a speech about loyalty or motherhood. I simply told her that until Monica could take responsibility without attaching conditions, explanations, or opportunities involving Graham, she would not have access to Phoebe through me. Mom started to say that this could split the family. The old guilt rose automatically. Then I pictured Phoebe folding the napkin into a white square, while everyone around her nodded. I let the guilt pass. For once, preserving the shape of the family was not my job. The next few days were calmer. Taryn sent Phoebe a short message about school and nothing else. Phoebe answered when she felt like it. Celia sent a photograph of a badly decorated cupcake she had made and did not mention the barbecue. Walter sent me one picture of the unfinished ramp. No caption. Monica sent nothing. Graham continued seeing Phoebe in small, ordinary doses. He was getting better at waiting. When she complained about something, he now asked whether she wanted help before turning the complaint into an assignment. That improvement made what happened next more complicated. I was at my desk near closing time when an email from Graham arrived. The subject line mentioned, "Options for Phoebe." I opened it expecting something small. It was not small. He had assembled a detailed set of possibilities for making her life easier. Home modifications, transportation, access to specialists, educational options, an accessibility redesign that extended far beyond the single science room problem we had already discussed. Everything was thoughtful. None of it was malicious. Some of it was genuinely generous. My eyes moved down the page. There were attachments, cost estimates, timelines, people already contacted. The familiar cold sensation returned to my hands, though for an entirely different reason than when Taryn had messaged me. Graham had learned to ask before moving Phoebe's wheelchair. He had not yet learned to stop trying to move her whole life. I read Graham's email 3 times before I understood why it unsettled me so much. Nothing in it was careless. Every item could remove a real difficulty from Phoebe's life. Home modifications, transportation, specialists, educational options. That made the problem harder, not easier. Names had already been contacted, and preliminary estimates prepared. Somebody was measuring possibilities against my daughter's life, and Phoebe had not been in the room. I closed the laptop and sat in the dim library office until the motion sensor light over the back shelves switched itself off. A month earlier, I might have seen only the gift. Now I saw the pattern. Graham had learned not to touch Phoebe's chair without asking. He had learned not to turn one complaint about a science room into a donation campaign. But somewhere beneath those lessons lived the same instinct that had built his entire adult life. Find the obstacle. Assemble resources. Move faster than the obstacle could grow. This time, the obstacle was 11 lost years. No amount of money could remove those. So he was trying to remove everything else. I waited until the next evening to bring it up. I did not want the conversation to happen over email, where every sentence could harden before the other person had a chance to see the face behind it. Graham came to the apartment at the time we had already planned for dinner with Phoebe. She was in her room finishing homework when I asked him to sit with me in the kitchen first. I had printed the proposal. The pages looked absurdly formal beside a bowl of apples, and the grocery list stuck beneath a magnet on the refrigerator. I told Graham I understood why he had made it. That was true. Then I told him why he could not keep moving forward that way. He listened at first with the careful concentration he used when trying not to repeat a mistake. I explained that Phoebe's life was not a damaged building waiting for an accessibility plan. Some changes might be useful. Others might not. The issue was not whether he could afford them. The issue was that he had begun arranging them before asking what she wanted. Graham looked toward the hallway. His jaw tightened. He said he had been trying to give her options, not decisions. The distinction might have sounded reasonable if the attachments had not included appointments already tentatively held and contractors who had been asked for estimates. I pointed to the pages. He glanced down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The anger I had expected did not come from him. Something more complicated did. Frustration, shame. The helplessness I had seen the first afternoon when I told him a specialist list was not what Phoebe needed from her father. He said that every week he noticed another thing she had learned to work around. A doorway, a school desk, transportation that required planning other children never had to think about. He had resources that could remove some of those problems, and doing nothing felt like another form of failing her. I understood that too. Understanding did not make it harmless. I told him there was a difference between removing a barrier and deciding which barriers bothered Phoebe enough to remove. Graham rubbed one hand over his face. He looked tired, in a way expensive suits could not hide. The conversation might have ended there if my fear had stayed out of it. It did not. I had spent weeks telling myself I was only protecting Phoebe's agency. Most of that was true. But fear has a way of hiding inside principles until somebody presses hard enough. Graham asked what I wanted him to do instead. Wait for every problem to become unbearable before offering help? Pretend he did not have resources because using them made me uncomfortable? The second question landed where he did not know. I was already bruised. I told him this was not about my comfort. He looked at the printed pages, then back at me, and said, it was beginning to feel as though every large thing he could offer Phoebe automatically became suspicious, simply because it was something I could not. The room seemed to shrink. I knew he regretted the sentence almost immediately. That did not stop it from finding the thought I had been trying not to name since science night. All the things he could give her. All the things I could not. Something sharp escaped before I could soften it. You can't rewrite 11 years with a check. Graham went still. I wished the words back as soon as they were between us. Not because they were entirely false. Because they were aimed at the deepest wound he had shown me. His eyes dropped toward the proposal. When he answered, his voice was lower. He said he knew perfectly well what money could not buy. He knew because he would have traded every asset attached to his name. For one ordinary Tuesday when Phoebe was 6, he did not raise his voice. That made my shame worse. Then he said something I was not prepared for. He told me that sometimes I used the word stability when what I really meant was keeping everything exactly as it had been before he arrived. My hands flattened against the edge of the table. The accusation felt unfair. Then I thought about the library nights. The relief I felt whenever Graham left. The way I had counted the small things only I knew about Phoebe, as if they were proof of ownership. I told him he had no idea what it was like to build a life around a child, and then have somebody arrive with enough money to redesign the entire landscape. Graham's expression changed. He said he was not trying to take her. I knew that. He had never threatened custody, never treated the adoption as temporary, never once suggested that biology erased the years Phoebe and I had shared. The danger had never been something Graham said. It was something I imagined. That made it harder to defend against. The truth had been waiting for me since the night I stood at the sink listening to Phoebe laugh with him on the phone. I had been afraid to say it because saying it made me sound smaller than the mother I wanted to be. Now, there was nowhere left to hide it. I told Graham that sometimes I was scared Phoebe would look at everything he could offer her and realize how little my world was by comparison. The sentence came out quietly. No anger left in it. Just fear. Suddenly I saw our apartment through the lens of comparison. Repainted cabinets. The narrow hallway Phoebe navigated with 3 careful turns. A used table I had repaired twice. I had never been ashamed of any of it before Graham arrived. He had not made me feel inadequate. I had done that myself. Graham looked around the kitchen, as though seeing the room through my eyes for the first time. He told me he did not think Phoebe measured love in square footage or specialist access. I knew that too. Still, the fear remained. I admitted that watching Phoebe grow close to him sometimes hurt, not because I wanted her to lose him, because every new memory they created reminded me there would be parts of her life I no longer occupied alone. Graham leaned back in the chair. For the first time since I met him, He seemed relieved by something painful. He admitted his own fear in return. He worried that if he moved too slowly, Phoebe would decide he was not trying hard enough. He had lost years by trusting that there would be more time. Now every instinct told him not to waste another day. There it was. My fear made me hold. His fear made him rush. Both of us had found ways to call those instincts love. Neither of us noticed Phoebe until the wheel of her chair touched the doorway. She had been there long enough. I knew it from her face. The homework folder rested across her lap. One hand still held a pencil. She was not crying. That would have been easier to respond to. Instead, she looked exhausted. Not physically. Older. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Phoebe rolled into the kitchen and stopped beside the end of the table. Her eyes moved from Graham's proposal to me. She asked what the papers were. I could have minimized them. Graham could have explained. Neither of us did. I told her they were ideas Graham had put together for things that might make parts of her life easier, and that he and I had been arguing about how those decisions should happen. Phoebe looked down at the pages. She did not ask how much anything cost. She did not ask what kind of apartment renovation was possible. She asked whether we had already decided anything. Graham said no. That was true, though only because I had stopped the process before the preliminary steps became commitments. Phoebe nodded once. Then she looked at me. I saw the exact moment she understood something neither Graham nor I had understood until then. This was not about a ramp, or a school, or money. We had spent weeks telling Phoebe that she did not have to apologize for needing space in the world. Then the two adults who loved her most had begun fighting over what shape that world should take. Her fingers tightened around the pencil. When she spoke, her voice was small enough that both of us had to stop moving to hear it. I spent years thinking nobody wanted me. Now the two people who do want me are making me feel like I have to choose. The pencil slipped from her hand and rolled beneath the table. Nobody bent to pick it up. She had heard the competition underneath our concern. My fear of being replaced, and Graham's fear that moving slowly would leave him a father only in blood. Every time we pulled in opposite directions, Phoebe had been standing in the middle. She told us she did not want to be the reason either of us gave things up. She did not want Graham spending money because he felt guilty. She did not want me refusing things because I was afraid. She did not want every decision to become proof of who loved her more. Her voice cracked on the last word. That was when I moved. Not toward Graham, toward my daughter. I crouched beside her chair the same way I had at the barbecue, but this time I did not ask her to reassure me. I told her I was sorry. I did not explain my intentions. Intentions had protected too many adults in my family already. Graham apologized too. He remained where he was, giving Phoebe space instead of turning the moment into a competition over who could comfort her first. That small restraint showed me he had heard her. Phoebe wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand and looked irritated that she had cried at all. We did not solve everything that night. That mattered. Healing would have felt false if one painful sentence instantly turned us into three perfectly adjusted people. What we did instead was make rules, simple ones. No major decision about Phoebe would move forward unless Phoebe had been asked first. Money would not turn an idea into an obligation. My history with Phoebe would not give me the right to freeze her life in the shape it had before Graham arrived. Graham's biology would not give him the right to accelerate intimacy or make up for lost years by controlling the next ones. And neither of us would ask Phoebe to prove that loving one of us did not diminish the other. Graham folded the proposal closed. He told Phoebe that every item in it was now only paper. If she wanted to revisit any part later, she could. If she wanted none of it, that would also be an answer. Phoebe considered that. Then she pointed to one page and said she might eventually want to talk about transportation when she was older. Not now. Graham nodded. He did not reach for his phone. That was important. I picked up the pencil from beneath the table and placed it beside her homework folder. Phoebe looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked something that shifted the story again. She wanted the family decisions to work the same way. For weeks, I had been deciding how much access Monica should have, whether Mom deserved another conversation, how quickly Dad could be allowed back into Phoebe's life. I had told myself I was protecting her. Some of that was protection, some of it was habit. Phoebe said she wanted to decide who she heard from and when. I felt the old maternal instinct rise immediately. Monica had already hurt her. Diane had already minimized it. Walter's ramp did not erase his silence at the barbecue. Then I remembered the words I had just agreed to live by. Ask her. Phoebe did not say she wanted everyone back. She wanted the right to decide what happened next. She said she was not ready to see Monica. She was willing to keep texting Taryn and Celia if they respected her boundaries. She wanted to know whether Grandpa had actually finished the ramp. She was unsure about Grandma. Then she said she wanted both Graham and me with her whenever she decided to face the family again. Not because she could not speak for herself, because she did not want to stand there alone. Graham looked toward me. This time, there was no contest in his expression. I understood the invitation for what it was. Phoebe was not choosing between us. She was choosing both of us to stand beside her. Later that night, after Graham left and Phoebe went back to finish the homework our argument had interrupted, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The proposal was gone. The apple bowl remained. So did the narrow hallway and the cabinets I had repainted. Nothing about our apartment had become smaller. Nothing about my motherhood had either. I had spent weeks fearing Graham would take my place. The truth was much less dramatic and far more difficult. There was no single place to take. Phoebe's life was not a chair one of us had to surrender before the other could sit down. The next decision would be hers. And when she was ready to return to the people who had once made her feel there was no room for her, Graham and I would go with her, not on opposite sides, beside her. Phoebe waited almost 2 weeks before deciding she was ready to go back to my parents' house. During those 2 weeks, nothing dramatic happened. That was part of what made the decision feel real. Walter did not keep sending photographs of the ramp. Diane did not call every day. Taryn and Celia respected the boundaries Phoebe had given them. Monica remained silent. Graham continued seeing Phoebe in small, ordinary ways, and, true to the promise he had made at our kitchen table, stopped treating silence as permission to move ahead. When Phoebe finally told me she wanted to see the house, she was very clear about why. She was not going there to forgive anyone. She wanted to see what had changed. Graham and I went with her because she had asked us both to. On the drive over, I expected her to be tense. Instead, she spent most of the trip looking out the window and correcting Graham about the name of a constellation he had misremembered from one of their recent conversations. The ordinary rhythm between them steadied me. Months earlier, I might have heard their familiarity and felt threatened by it. Now I heard something else. Phoebe had room for both of us. My parents' street looked exactly as it always had. The same maple tree leaned over the corner. The same faded basketball hoop stood 3 houses down. Nothing about the neighborhood announced that the last time Phoebe had been there, she had left believing a family barbecue had no place for her. Then we turned into the driveway. The plywood was gone. Walter had built a permanent ramp from the side path to the back entrance. It was not decorative. There was no ribbon waiting for Phoebe. No sign, no fresh bouquet positioned nearby to make the apology photogenic. The slope was gentle. The surface had enough texture for wet weather. The handrail was set back so it would not narrow the turn at the top. I knew my father's work well enough to recognize care in the details. Phoebe slowed when she saw it. Walter stood several feet away near the garage. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his work pants, even though he had been retired for years. He did not walk toward her. He simply waited. Phoebe looked at me. I said nothing. She rolled forward and tested the ramp herself. The first time she had entered that house using his scrap plywood, I had kept one hand braced against the board because it shifted beneath her wheels. This time she went up without anybody touching anything. At the top, she stopped. Walter's face changed. He had spent 30 years building things that were meant to carry weight. Only now, watching his granddaughter use a ramp he should have built years earlier, did he seem to understand what he had actually failed to support. He apologized before we entered the house. Not broadly, not beautifully, specifically. He admitted he had laughed when I told him I was adopting Phoebe. He admitted that every time she came to the house, he saw the steps and knew he could make them easier. He had kept putting the work off because Phoebe always found a way around the problem. Her independence had allowed him to pretend the barrier did not matter. Then he admitted what happened at the barbecue. He had heard Monica reduce Phoebe to the inconvenience of a wheelchair and had nodded. He did not claim he had been confused. He did not say he was trying to keep the peace. He told Phoebe he had been wrong. The apology ended there. He did not ask whether she forgave him. That was the part I trusted most. Phoebe looked down at the ramp. Her fingertips moved once against her wheel rim. She told him she was not ready to act like everything was fine. Walter nodded. She said she might come back again someday. That tiny word, might, was all he received. His eyes filled anyway. Inside, my mother had set out drinks and food, with the nervous precision she used whenever she wanted a room to feel normal before the people inside it were ready. The chairs were farther apart than usual. The path through the dining room was clear. I noticed those things without giving them more credit than they deserved. Diane had spent years believing that small acts of hospitality could repair injuries nobody had named. Phoebe did not need refreshments. She needed honesty. For a while, Mom avoided the real subject. She asked about school and listened while Phoebe described a recent assignment. Graham remained quiet, unless Phoebe drew him into the conversation. Walter stayed near the kitchen counter and seemed to understand that his apology had not earned him the right to lead anything. Eventually, Diane reached the point she had been circling. She said she hoped this visit meant the family could begin healing. The phrase sounded harmless. Then came the condition hidden inside it. Families, she said, could not stay broken forever. I watched Phoebe's face. Months earlier, I would have stepped in immediately. I would have translated Mom's meaning, softened Phoebe's response, or redirected the conversation before it became uncomfortable. Part 8 had taught me what that kind of protection could cost. Phoebe asked her grandmother why the person who got hurt always seemed to be responsible for putting the family back together. Diane opened her mouth, then closed it. Phoebe had not raised her voice. She had not delivered a speech. She had only asked a child's question that no adult in the room could make smaller. Mom looked toward me. For once, I did not help her. The silence lasted long enough to become an answer. Then the front door opened. I knew from Diane's face that Monica's arrival was not an accident. My mother looked immediately apologetic, which meant she had invited her without telling us. Something in me hardened. Phoebe's hands settled on her wheels. Graham remained where he was. Monica stepped into the room carrying nothing. No gift, no flowers, no obvious prop. Her face had been arranged into an expression I had seen many times growing up. Wounded enough to invite sympathy, controlled enough to suggest everyone else was being unreasonable. She began by saying she wanted to apologize. For a few minutes, the words almost sounded different from the messages she had sent after the barbecue. She said the comment about pushing Phoebe's wheelchair had been cruel. She admitted Taryn should never have been taught to think helping her cousin was something to avoid. But Monica had never learned how to leave an apology alone. Soon she was explaining how stressed she had been that day. Then she mentioned how difficult the fallout had become for Taryn and Celia. She moved from harm to inconvenience so smoothly that the pattern revealed itself before she seemed aware of it. Phoebe listened. I watched Monica search her face for signs that the apology was working. When none appeared, my sister changed tactics. She said everyone had made mistakes and that it was time to think about what came next. She mentioned Taryn's interest in leadership programs. She referred to the Sterling Foundation as though it had somehow become part of the family conversation. Then she looked toward Graham. There it was. The real reason she had come. Monica framed the request carefully. Taryn was bright. A connection or recommendation could help. Graham's foundation already worked with young people. Nothing extraordinary was being asked. Nothing except access to a man she had ignored, until he walked through the gate behind the child she considered inconvenient. I looked at Phoebe. She had gone completely still. Graham answered before I did. His voice remained calm. Phoebe is my daughter. She is not a credential. The sentence landed harder because he did nothing else with it. No threat to Monica's job. No mention of money. No reminder of what he could destroy if he chose. He simply closed the door she had been trying to open through Phoebe. Monica's face tightened. For the first time that afternoon, the apology disappeared entirely. She accused us of twisting everything she said. She insisted she cared about Phoebe and had only wanted something positive to come from a difficult situation. When I reminded her that she had been the one telling her children not to get stuck helping Phoebe before Graham ever appeared, Monica turned toward me with the old expression she used whenever I stopped cooperating with the version of events she preferred. Then she used the oldest argument we had. She was my sister. Once, those words would have carried years of obligation behind them. Now they felt almost empty. I told her that being my sister did not give her automatic access to my daughter. Monica stared at me. I could see her waiting for Diane to intervene. Mom always had. She had spent our childhood catching Monica's sharpest edges before they produced consequences. Monica insulted someone, and Diane explained she had been tired. Monica excluded me, and Mom reminded me that older sisters could be territorial. Monica said something cruel, and the family discussed tone instead of intention, until nobody remembered who had actually been hurt. Monica looked toward her now. Diane's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She had just watched Monica begin with an apology, pivot toward Taryn, then finally reach for Graham's foundation, the same pattern I had been describing for weeks. Her eyes moved once to Phoebe, then back to Monica. For several seconds, she said nothing. Monica repeated that the barbecue comment had simply come out wrong. My mother lifted her head. No, you did mean it. The room changed. I had heard Diane contradict Monica before, over small things. I had never heard her refuse to rescue her from a moral consequence. Monica looked almost more shocked by Mom than she had when Graham appeared at the barbecue. Diane did not continue. She did not list grievances or perform a conversion for the room. She only said that Taryn's message proved the comment had not been accidental and that continuing to pretend otherwise had made the damage worse. For once, my mother stopped translating cruelty into misunderstanding. Monica had nowhere left to retreat. Walter did not defend her. Diane did not soften her words. Graham had denied the status connection she wanted, and I was no longer interested in preserving peace at Phoebe's expense. The most painful consequence came from her own daughters. Taryn and Celia were not in the room, but Monica admitted they had stopped allowing her to speak for them about Phoebe. Taryn had told her she did not want any Sterling Foundation opportunity, if the only reason she received it was because of Graham. Celia had begun correcting Monica whenever she referred to the barbecue as a misunderstanding. Monica had taught her daughters how to exclude Phoebe. Now, they were beginning to see the lesson for what it was. That was not a punishment Graham could have purchased. It was a consequence Monica had built herself. Phoebe finally spoke. She did not tell Monica she hated her. She did not demand an apology better than the one she had received. She simply said she did not want Monica contacting her directly anymore. Monica's expression collapsed. She turned toward me, expecting me to override an 11-year-old child for the sake of family unity. I did not, Phoebe continued, slowly deciding each boundary as she named it. Taryn and Celia could text her as long as they respected when she did not answer. Grandpa could have limited visits. She wanted to see whether the change lasted longer than one ramp. Grandma could write to her for now. Phoebe was not ready for regular visits because she still did not trust Diane not to explain Monica away. Then Phoebe looked at Monica. No contact. Not now, possibly not later. She did not promise anything, The decision was hers. I told Monica I would enforce it. She left my parents' house without the reconciliation she had expected and without the connection to Graham she had hoped to use. In the days that followed, she removed the public references she had made to our family miracle and stopped using Phoebe's reunion as something she could attach herself to socially. Graham's office had made clear that any request involving Phoebe would require Phoebe's and my consent. She had not lost a fortune. She had lost something she valued more than she understood until it was gone. Access. Control. The ability to tell the family's story in a way that always placed her near the center. Most of all, she had lost the assumption that being related to Phoebe guaranteed a place in her life. We stayed at my parents' house another hour after Monica left. Nothing became magically comfortable. Walter showed Phoebe one small adjustment he wanted to make to the ramp and asked whether the turn at the top felt wide enough. He waited for her answer before touching anything. Diane did not ask for forgiveness. She looked tired and ashamed, which was probably where she needed to begin. When we finally returned to the car, Phoebe paused beside the ramp. She ran one palm lightly across the rail. Then she rolled down. This time nobody steadied a board beneath her. On the drive home, Graham sat beside me while Phoebe watched the evening light move across the windows. For a while, she said nothing. Then, Graham asked her one question. Her birthday was coming. What did she want it to look like? By the time Phoebe's 12th birthday arrived, the question Graham had asked in the car had become less complicated than any of us expected. She did not want a ballroom. She did not want a hotel filled with people she had never met, a photographer, or anything with the sterling name printed across it. She did not want an expensive event meant to compensate for birthdays Graham had missed. When he first asked, she thought for several days, and finally chose the community room at my library, the same building where so much of our new life had begun to fit together. The choice made sense to her in ways money could not improve. The entrance was level, the doors were wide. The tables could be moved without turning accessibility into an emergency project after somebody arrived. Phoebe knew which hallway was quiet when she needed a minute away from noise, and which window caught the sunset in late afternoon. She had spent ordinary Saturdays there with me long before Graham appeared, and it was where she had opened the first of his letters. Nobody had to redesign the room for her birthday. That mattered. The gathering was small. Walter came after respecting Phoebe's limits, long enough to earn another visit. He had built her a wooden stand for astronomy books, but left it in the car until she said she wanted it. The ramp at my parents' house remained where he had built it, used without being turned into proof that everything was forgiven. Their relationship was still smaller than he wanted, but honest enough to grow. Diane's return had taken longer. After Phoebe allowed letters, but not regular visits, Mom wrote briefly and specifically, never explaining Monica or demanding an answer. Phoebe opened them when she chose. Eventually, she decided Grandma could attend the birthday. It was not forgiveness on command. It was an opening. Taryn and Celia came together. Their relationship with Phoebe had rebuilt itself unevenly ridiculous videos, schoolwork questions, ordinary annoyances instead of conversations organized around guilt. Normal irritation had become its own sign of repair. Monica was not there, and nobody turned her absence into a debate or a symbolic empty chair. Phoebe had made her decision in my parents' living room. The people in this room were there because she wanted them there. Graham arrived without making an entrance. That sentence would once have sounded impossible to anyone who knew him only from newspapers. He came carrying the old wooden letterbox beneath one arm and a small paper bag in the other. No staff followed him. No extravagant gift appeared behind him. The bag contained the lemon cookies Phoebe liked from the bakery near school. He had remembered. Watching them together no longer triggered the same sharp counting instinct in me. I did not measure how often Phoebe smiled at him against how often she smiled at me. I did not catalog the things he could afford that I could not. The fear had not vanished in one dramatic revelation. It had simply lost strength each time Graham showed up, without trying to replace what had come before. He had learned that being present was not the same thing as taking over. Phoebe had learned something too. She no longer looked toward me every time Graham offered an idea, waiting to see whether accepting it might hurt me. That freedom had taken work from both of us. Near the beginning of the party, I saw a small example of how much Graham had changed. Phoebe had been showing him an astronomy program on one of the library computers. The old monitor flickered whenever the cable shifted. Months earlier, Graham would probably have noticed the equipment, made 2 calls, and had a replacement system delivered before Monday. I watched his eyes move toward the screen. The old impulse appeared. Then he stopped. He asked Phoebe whether she wanted him to look into something better for the astronomy nights she and I still held at the library. Phoebe leaned back in her chair and studied him with exaggerated seriousness. "You finally learned to ask." Graham smiled. She told him the computer was annoying, but fine for now. If it died completely, she would let him know. He accepted that answer. No phone appeared. No assistant was contacted. The broken cable survived another day. I found myself smiling from across the room. There had been a time when Graham believed love meant removing every obstacle before Phoebe had to encounter it. Now he understood that sometimes loving her meant allowing an annoying computer to remain annoying because she had decided it was not worth fixing yet. The difference sounded small. It was not. After cake, the room became quieter. Walter and Diane were helping Taryn and Celia clear paper plates from one side of the table when Graham placed the old wooden box in front of Phoebe. I had not seen all 11 letters together for several weeks. The envelopes were open now. Some had been returned to the box inside clear sleeves because the folds had weakened. Phoebe had read them gradually, never in chronological order. There had been days when she wanted one, and weeks when she did not want to think about the box at all. Each had given her a different Graham. The hopeful father who assumed finding her would take months. The desperate man chasing bad leads. The grieving father, writing after being told his child was dead. The man who saw strangers in airports and briefly imagined impossible reunions. The older Graham who no longer knew whether writing was hope, habit, or remembrance. 11 birthdays. 11 versions of absence. Graham reached into his jacket and removed one more envelope. It was marked 12. Unlike the others, it was not sealed. Phoebe noticed immediately. She picked it up and ran one finger beneath the open flap. "Why didn't you seal this one?" Graham looked at her. "Because this year I know where you are." The room seemed to become very still around us. Phoebe lowered her eyes to the envelope. I watched her take out the page. She read silently. Nobody crowded behind her. Nobody asked what it said. We had all learned something about giving her room. I did not know every word Graham had written. Phoebe never showed me the entire letter, and I never asked her to. Later, she told me enough to understand why she cried before reaching the bottom. Graham had written that for 11 years. Every letter began from absence. This one began from gratitude. He did not write that he had finally gotten his daughter back. He wrote that Phoebe had allowed him into her life. There was a difference. He wrote about the first time she corrected him for touching nothing but still moving too fast. He mentioned science night, the astronomy sessions, and the day she told him she did not want her life fixed around her. Then he wrote about me. Phoebe stopped there. Her eyes moved over the same paragraph twice. I felt Graham glance toward me but kept my attention on her. When she finished the page, she handed it to me, folded so that only that section was visible. Graham had written that he could spend the rest of his life regretting the years he lost, but regret would never change who had been there during them. He thanked me for knowing the child he had only been able to imagine, for learning how Phoebe went quiet when she was afraid, for sitting through hospital appointments he had missed, for making a home where she learned she could be stubborn, funny, angry, difficult, brilliant, tired, and loved without any of those things canceling another. He did not call me the woman who raised his daughter for him. He called me her mother. The words blurred before I reached the end of the paragraph. For months, I had feared that biology would turn motherhood into a contest with one winner. Graham had spent the same months learning there was nothing to win. Phoebe had never needed one of us to disappear so the other could matter. I folded the page back along the line she had made and returned it to her. She slipped the letter into its envelope. Then she reached beside her chair and picked up a card I had noticed earlier, but assumed was for someone else. It was small, made from dark blue paper, with tiny silver stars she had drawn around the edge herself. Phoebe held it for a moment, then she gave it to Graham. His expression changed before he even opened it. On the front, in Phoebe's handwriting, were 2 words, "For Dad." Graham stopped breathing in the same way he had at my parents' gate, months earlier. Back then, he had been a man staring at the daughter he had thought was dead. Now he was a father being told what place she had chosen for him. He did not make a speech. Thank God. Anything elaborate would have broken the moment. He opened the card, read whatever Phoebe had written inside, and pressed his lips together while his eyes filled. Phoebe looked suddenly embarrassed by the intensity of his reaction. She muttered that he was making it weird. That made him laugh. It made her laugh too. I stood a few feet away and felt the small ache I had always known might come when I finally heard her call him Dad. The ache was real. So was the joy. One did not cancel the other. Then Phoebe reached for my hand as I passed her chair. She did it without looking up, the same casual way she had reached for me hundreds of times before. Her fingers closed around mine. Nothing had been taken. The room slowly returned to motion after that. Taryn complained that Celia had eaten the last cookie. Walter pretended he had not taken one earlier. Diane gathered napkins into a stack even though nobody had asked her to. Graham placed the 12th letter inside the wooden box with the others. Except Phoebe took it back out almost immediately and tucked it into the side pouch of her wheelchair. The same pouch she had kept checking at the barbecue months earlier. That afternoon came back to me with unexpected clarity. The loose plywood. The crowded patio. Phoebe folding a napkin smaller and smaller beneath her fingers. Taryn repeating words she had learned from Monica. This place wasn't designed for people like you. At the time, the sentence had described more than my parents' backyard. It described the way Phoebe had learned to move through too many rooms. Enter quietly. Adjust. Do not inconvenience anyone. Be grateful when people remember you after you arrive. Apologize when your body requires the world to move 6 inches. I looked around the library room. Nobody had needed to drag a table aside when Phoebe entered. Nobody had complained about the route from the parking lot. Nobody had assigned one child the job of helping her. Nobody had congratulated themselves for including her. The room had simply worked. The people inside it had learned something similar. Walter had built the ramp without demanding she use it. Diane had written without demanding replies. Taryn and Celia had apologized without demanding forgiveness. Graham had learned to ask before acting. I had learned that protecting Phoebe did not mean controlling every door she opened. And Phoebe had learned she did not have to prove she was easy enough to deserve a place. Near the end of the afternoon, she rolled toward the window where the light had begun turning gold across the floor. The wooden box rested on the table behind her. Letter 12 was tucked safely at her side. Graham stood a little distance away. I stood on the other. Neither of us reached for her chair. We did not need to. For the first time, the place had not been changed for Phoebe after she arrived. It had been chosen with her in mind.